really enjoy talking to audiences, and I only regret that we aren't doing this in person, so we could chat beforehand, chat afterwards, perhaps have a cup of tea while we're doing that. But since we can't be in person, let me proceed. So this is obviously a huge topic, the history of the Jews of the United States. Again, a history which, as Gabriel said, spans the period from the middle of the 17th century to today. So to say the least, what you're going to get today is a gloss. It's just going to touch on some general issues that are suggested by this topic. Now, first we want to ask, well, why is this important? Okay, the history of the Jews of the United States. And on the one hand, we could say the history of any Jewish community is really fascinating. The history of the Jews of South Africa, the history of the Jews of Australia, Ireland, the British Isles, and so on. So history is interesting no matter what. But I think that this is a particularly significant issue, in as much as by the 1920s, when the great era of of European migration came to an end, there was a phenomenal transformation and a phenomenal transplantation of the Jewish population, which had just occurred. And in 100 years, from 1820 to 1920, about 1/3 of world Jewry, and that's the Jews of Europe from the West, from as far west as Alsace and as far east as Ukraine. So that's basically all of Europe, as well as the Ottoman Empire. So 1/3 of world Jewry picked up and moved across some national boundary. Now, this was a period of tremendous change and mobility. And of those Jews who crossed a boundary to go someplace else, 85 to 90% came to the United States. It's a staggering figure, okay, that no other destination was as appealing. No other destination was as attractive to the Jews of the world who were looking to both, and I want to emphasize both, looking both to improve the conditions, the economic conditions of their lives, and to find a home that was less fraught by difficulty and by restrictions or limitations. So again, 85 to 90% came to the United States. And frankly, if we have good reason to believe that the 10 to 15% that didn't come to the United States would have, if they could have, okay, but for all sorts of reasons, some percentage chose other destinations as the place to rebuild their lives. So as an entree to this longer topic, which takes us back to the 17th century and takes us beyond 1920, we might frame it around the question of why was the United States or America, North America, so attractive? What about the United States and even its predecessor, that is British North America, what made it so attractive? So let's begin, and hopefully you'll have some questions. So first, we can say that for the about 4 million Jews, 3.5 million or so, because the numbers are very elusive, Jews who came to North America, again, starting in the 17th century and accelerating after 1820, there was no other place to which they could have gone, which offered them as large a bundle of rights as individuals and rights as Jews. So let's just think a little bit about that early period, what in American history called the Colonial Period. And here, while the number of Jews was relatively small, maybe about 3,000 by the time of the American Revolution. But remember, it was also a very small European population as well. We can already see that Jews suffered relatively few disabilities as Jews. And in those of the colonies where they suffered disabilities, they weren't alone. Okay, so we can't forget the fact that these colonies were built on slavery. So some enormous percentage of the people living in those colonies were chattel slaves. Okay, but on top of that, where and when Jews in the period from in the 17th century, where our talk begins, until about the 1820s, where Jews suffered some limitations on their rights, they were usually lumped together with Catholics, with Quakers, with others who were not members of the dominant established religious tradition. So I'm going to tell one story to just explore, to just kind of give a hint of this. So we know the first Jews come to North America in 1654. Okay, there were probably individual Jews living there before, but the first group that come in 1654 were a group of Jews who had been living in Brazil under Dutch rule and enjoyed a very comfortable life. And then when the Portuguese recapture Brazil, the Jews leave and they come to New Amsterdam, okay, the next Dutch port in the Atlantic world. And they were met by Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Governor General of New Amsterdam. And he was very committed to New Amsterdam remaining a Dutch reform colony, okay, that kind of form or a variant on Calvinism. And he was not happy to have these Jews present. Okay, Stuyvesant writes to the company that owned the colony, the Dutch West Indies Company, and said, what do I do with this accursed race? Okay, that's what he calls them, this accursed race. And the answer from the company was the Jews should have the right to remain. Okay, the Jews could remain, but they were limited. And there were some specific restrictions. They could not worship in public. Okay, they could worship in private, but not in public. Okay, they couldn't serve in the guard. They were banned from certain forms of trade. But what I want to focus very briefly on the restriction that they couldn't pray in public. At the same time, the company said that Lutherans were not allowed to even pray in private. Okay, Catholics could not step foot on New Amsterdam on pain of death. Okay, so while yes, Jews were limited, they couldn't pray in public, their limitations were way less severe than the limitations on Lutherans, and much more so on the limitations on Catholics. So this illustrative story, which, by the way, those restrictions only last for a few years because the Dutch don't last much longer. And within 10 years, the British take over, New Amsterdam becomes New York, and that is the end of those restrictions. But Jews, their experience in North America and then in the United States was one in which they were never the only group to suffer restrictions or to be impeded by some restrictions. In the long period of time that this history covers, Jews were not alone among immigrants. And so this, again, is a very important characteristic of life for Jews and the attractiveness of America for Jews, in that it was the world's largest receiver of immigrants. Okay, starting in 1820 and then going for a century and beyond, the United States received more immigrants from more places, speaking a wider array of languages than any other country in the world. Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, South Africa were all immigrant destinations, and none of them could compare in size and the size of the immigrant population, both in sheer number and percentage to the United States. So here we get a little bit of a hint about why the United States was so attractive to Jews. They didn't stand out as being the example, or they didn't embody the idea of immigrant. We could think of them standing under an umbrella, and the umbrella is called immigration. And under that umbrella are dozens and dozens of other people: Italians, Greeks, Hungarians, Irish, Germans, Poles, Swedes, Norwegians, Dutch, and so on. And Jews don't really stand out. Okay, they are one of many immigrant populations. So again, I'm not a big statistics person, but I think this next one is pretty revealing. Chicago in 1900, Jews were about 5 to 6% of the city's population. Okay, not small, but not huge. Say about 5 to 6% of the city's population. The city of Chicago in 1900, 80% of the population of Chicago were immigrants and their children. And again, there were Poles, there were Hungarians, Lithuanians, Norwegians, Ukrainians, Germans, Italians, and Jews. And so Jews were included in this immigrant world. And there was nothing unusual about them being newcomers to America, not speaking English, being the children of immigrants, having to navigate between the American and the ethnic life. So there is, again, a way of seeing why America was so different. They didn't stand out. Okay, in this very long history, okay, again from 1654, when the story begins, and sadly to this very day, Jews enjoyed the privilege of being white. They were defined by the law as white. Now, a lot of people say, well, they had to become white, or they weren't really white, but by law, they were white. Okay, their whiteness is never challenged. So at no point in their history could they not own property, go into a court and expect to get their cases heard. At no point in time could they were they denied the rights of citizenship because of their color. At no point in time was their liberty, their freedom of movement, their control over their own bodies, okay, jeopardized by the fact of their being Jews. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't places where they experienced prejudice. That doesn't mean that there weren't neighborhoods, country clubs, hotels, some private universities, those kinds of entities where they didn't meet restriction, but at no point were they defined as not white and therefore not capable of becoming citizens. So again, we can think of just as a point of comparison. Okay, in 1917, in an immigration law passed by the U.S. Congress, Congress declared that no one from Asia could come to the United States as an immigrant, okay, and that Asians, anyone born in Asia, now they meant obviously people who were phenotypically, who were marked physically by their being Asian, could never become citizens. This actually goes back to 1882 in the Chinese Exclusion Act. They could never become citizens. Now, no law, even remotely like that, was directed at Jews. Okay, they always had the right to become citizens, the option of becoming naturalized, becoming citizens, and there were no restrictions in immigration on Jews. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, wait a minute, what about the restrictions in the 1920s, the 1921 and 1924 immigration restrictions? Okay, notably, Jews are not mentioned in those laws. There's no Jewish quota. Jews were subsumed in the same quota that went for Germans or Poles or Romanians or Hungarians. Jews were not marked in that legislation at all. And while the restrictions of the 1920s had tremendous implications for Jews, okay, obviously we know, not sadly is too mild the word, but given the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s and the terror experienced by Europe's Jews, the immigration quotas really worked against them. But again, not because they were Jews, but because they were coming from countries with very low quotas. And we could say that a Polish Christian had no more access to getting a visa than a Polish Jew. Okay, it was whatever quota Poland got, okay, Jews and Christians were subjected to the same system. So Jews were, again, in terms of why the United States was so attractive, the fact that there were so many immigrants from so many places, that Jews shared in their fate and didn't stand out as notably alien. Okay, Jews benefited from the fact of their being defined by law as white and being able to engage in whatever activities they wanted as individuals. Okay, which takes us in a way to a third and maybe the most important reason the United States was so attractive to Jews, which was they were able to partake of the economic opportunities available in the United States. Okay, the migration of Jews from Europe and the Ottoman Empire to the United States was primarily an economic migration. It was a migration of people who faced very limited economic opportunities back home, and indeed for whom increasing poverty had devastating effects on on individuals, families, communities. And the United States, the attractiveness of the United States was literally, as of about 1820, the most dynamic economy in the world. Okay, this is not Make America Great Again. It's not a kind of a hyperbole in terms of the rate of productivity, the rate of expansion of manufacturing, the rate of the growth of the gross national product. No place in the world equaled the United States. And so it was an incredibly rich opportunity, a sort of venue for opportunity for somebody willing to come and do hard work. Okay, it wasn't easy, but willing to do hard work, and people who could imagine that they were going to end their lives better off than they had begun, and that for sure their children would not replicate their poverty. Okay, and I'm going to give one example again, because we have so little time and it's just such a huge topic. But it's one that's actually not so far from the history of places like Colorado and the Midwest, but also the South and the Far West, which was young Jewish men, and then sometimes not so young Jewish men, got their first American start, their start in the American economy as peddlers. Okay, as men who put packs on their backs and went out into the countryside and went house by house, farm by farm, mining to the mining camps, to the logging camps, and sold goods. Okay, now this was a classic Jewish occupation going back to the Middle Ages, and most Jewish peddlers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in the German lands, or in places like Lithuania, pretty much if they started out as peddlers, they were going to die as peddlers, and their sons were going to become peddlers. Okay, for the Jews who come to the United States who are willing to go into peddling, and it's an enormous part of the Jewish economy. The years of peddling were pretty limited: 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and from there it was opening up a store. Okay, dry goods, a clothing store. Some of those clothing stores blossomed into department stores. Some of those owners of department stores or former peddlers and shopkeepers became fabulously wealthy. And a name that actually has a Colorado connection is the Guggenheims. Okay, and the first Guggenheim, Meyer Guggenheim, comes as a peddler. And we know he didn't end up as a peddler, and we know his family name is now emblazoned on, the Guggenheim Museum. And Gabriel mentioned I had gotten a Guggenheim Fellowship, and Rosenwald and Lehman and Seligman. They all began as pack peddlers. Now, most peddlers don't end up like that, okay? But most of them became the proprietors of small shops in towns, in large cities, and were managed to make for themselves a pretty comfortable living. Okay, and there were no restrictions on where they could go, what they could sell, to whom they could sell, and the like. Certainly by the 1870s and 1880s, as the Jewish migration began to be primarily from Eastern Europe, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and places like Lithuania and Latvia, and Belarus, and Ukraine, and so on. Many of those Jews made their first start in the United States in the garment industry. Okay, and as as laborers, pressers, cutters, sewing machine operators, buttonhole makers, and the like. And that too was based on the fact that the United States had emerged as the center of the world garment trade. And so there's a kind of almost complementarity of Jewish economic skills or Jewish economic experiences pre-migration and in the post-migration period. So the economy of the United States worked well for Jews. Okay. Doesn't mean that there weren't poor people among them. We know there were poor people because every Jewish community had its orphanage, and it had its various charitable societies that gave out coal in the winter, free food, free fuel, and so on. But for the most part, the history was one of some level of economic mobility based on the dynamism of the American economy. Okay, so we have immigration, we have race and Jews as white, we have the reality of the economy as an American, a reality of American life. I think that we must talk about religion and the fact that, Jews were a religious minority in a Christian sea in the United States. And it's very interesting to think about the fact that they were the first non-Christian group to immigrate to the United States. Okay, now they weren't the first non-Protestant group, and in a way, the experience of Catholics was very informative for understanding the fate of Judaism. But for our purposes today, just say that Jews are the first group of non-Christians who come into a nation which informally considered itself a Christian nation. And so in what way did that impact the Jews? And how did it, however, make America attractive? So even though, again, Americans generally said this is a Christian nation, It is notable the state, the government, never said that. Okay, and you might be familiar with the fact that at a number of times, starting in the right after the end of the Civil War, there was actually an effort to pass a constitutional amendment to formally declare the United States a Christian nation. Okay, so there was an attempt to pass such an amendment. It always failed. It never passed. It never got admitted into. Never passed and became part of the U.S. Constitution. But in a way, there was a commitment. However, there may have been some people who disagreed. There was a commitment to saying the Christianity of this nation is private, it's not public. Okay, and in public, all religions are free to organize themselves and to serve their congregants, are free to pursue their ritual practices however they want. Okay, so that there's no interference on the part of the state in the religious lives of the American people. Now, there are, again, some fascinating exceptions to this, but none of them involve the Jews. And so, for example, when Utah tried to enter the United States, absolutely not until Mormonism got rid of polygamy. Okay, Brigham Young has a vision and gets rid of polygamy, so Utah can enter the United States. The Utah Territory can become a state. But in the broadest sense of the word, religious communities were free to do what they wanted. Now, this had really interesting implications for Judaism because it meant that Jewish religious leaders had, the only power they had was winning over the affections or the sympathies or the loyalty of the people who would pay dues and support the synagogues. Okay, but there is no connection between church and state. Okay? Many Supreme Court cases that made that more complicated than it sounds, but the wall between church and state was built and remained pretty much without too many cracks. And so Jews knew they were coming to a place where nobody would impede their practice of Judaism. And again, I can only give one example for so many of these points because we have such a limited time. But I would say that one of the earliest acts of Congress, even before the Constitution, but in that period after the Revolution, but before the adoption of the Constitution, when the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation. If one could think that far back to junior high school history class, the Articles of Confederation, supposedly a failure. But one of the first acts of the Congress under the Articles was to create something called the Northwest Territory. And these were lands west of the Appalachians, lands that would become Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And the law really I don't want to go into too much detail, but it was how they could become states. And one of the stipulations in the Northwest Ordinance was complete religious freedom. First act of Congress, complete religious freedom in the new territories. Okay, so this had to be attractive to Jews who back home in Bavaria, in Posen, in Hungary, in Lithuania, wherever, where the state, the non-Jewish authorities did attempt, and often successfully, to limit Jewish religious practice. Okay, so this, I think, was extremely important. And in some ways, the fact of America, of the principle of freedom of religion in the United States, made all religions seem pretty good. And I was just this morning, I saw that an example from the 1850s, when there were very few Jews in the United States, that Christian ministers started going to visit synagogues because they thought it was so interesting. They had read about Jews and Judaism in the pages of the Bible, but they'd never seen Jewish religious practice. And one very eminent New York Episcopalian minister wrote about his visit to the synagogue. It was Congregation Sherith Israel. And he said it was so dignified and it was so inspiring. And then he said, this is exactly what Solomon's temple looked like in Jerusalem. Now, we know it didn't, because we don't really know what Solomon's temple looked like in Jerusalem. But this idea that religion was a good and important pillar of civic life really worked for the advantage of the Jews. Okay, and then we could add that in terms of trying to understand what made life in the United States not only attractive to Jewish immigrants, but what was going on in the United States that caused, that made it possible for Jews and Judaism to flourish, is in a way a kind of really simple little fact, which is that in American history, there was never an anti-Semitic party. There was no political party that staked its reputation on demonizing the Jews. Okay, now we know in France and in Austria, in Germany, there were where there were many parties competing against each other. Okay, there was often a party that was associated with anti-Jewish rhetoric or with what we might call anti-Semitism. That never happens in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party who maybe didn't like Jews, okay, or maybe who thought Jews had too much influence, but the parties as the standard bearers, as the engines for the elections, who's going to become governor, who's going to become mayor, who's going to get elected to city council, president, and so on. The parties never demonized the Jews. And in some ways, this is because both parties always wanted their votes. Okay, Jewish men until the 1920s, and then Jewish men and women had always the right to vote, and no party ever wanted to essentially say we don't care about their votes. And so, in many elections where we have good historical material on the elections, the Republicans, the Democrats, if they're third parties, they all come and try to tell the Jews how much they love them and want that one thing the Jews have, which is a vote. Okay, each individual Jew, Jewish man, then Jewish women, they want their votes. And so it was never in the interest of either party to say, we don't care about them. Now, what the Jews got out of it is another matter, but we do know that Jews are holding office from very early date, from the 1820s on. Jews are getting elected to office. They're serving at the local level, city council, the road commission, school board, mayors, governors, and so on. And again, to just give an example, Oregon has a Jewish governor in the 1850s, at the same time that Oregon had a black code, and which stipulated that no black person could enter the state of Oregon and remain for more than 2 weeks. So Jews become part of that political process. And in that political process, in being part of that political process, they were able to present themselves as kind of just like all other Americans. Okay, we're here for the civic good, but also when they can and when they felt they needed to, they could serve the interests of the Jewish people. Okay, the Jewish people locally, nationally, and abroad. So I've sort of very quickly run through the issue of immigration, the issue of race, the issue of the American economy, the issue of American religion, the issue of the American political system. And saying all this may sound very upbeat and very kind of, again, flag waving. And I don't mean it quite that way, because it's not that there weren't people and institutions for the entirety of American history that didn't have some negative things to say about Jews. Okay, now you may notice that I have not yet used the word anti-Semitism. I haven't used that word, and it's a word we think about a lot right now. It's something that's very much on our tongues, as it were, given the events, I'd say certainly since Charlottesville. And so I'm not going to say that there was no anti-Semitism. Okay, for sure there was, but it was not an American tradition. It was not a key part of American life. And the ways in which Jews experienced America was certainly shaped by the fact that they were a minority. Okay, they were a minority in this large Christian place. They were a minority because until 1930, a majority of American Jews were immigrants. But it was not a factor that profoundly shaped the way Jewish communities organized themselves. It was not a factor that profoundly limited the access Jews had to the resources of American society. Now, people will point to, for example, that there were hospitals that didn't allow or that really restricted the number of Jewish doctors who could have privileges at those hospitals. So, I mean, that's absolutely true. But notably in those same communities, there were an equal number of hospitals that that did give Jews those privileges. And so, yes, individual Jewish doctors had to navigate, okay, around the restrictions, but the restrictions were not, shall we say, a matter of locked doors. So again, just a very small example. Okay, so in 1931, okay, the dean of admissions, the dean of the Yale Medical School sent a memo to the to the director of admissions. Okay, who should the Yale Medical School admit this year? What should our class look like? And he said, I suggest you take 5 Jews, 2 Italian Catholics, and no Negroes. Okay, so what we see there, I mean, obviously there may have been a 6th or a 7th or an 8th Jewish applicant to Yale, applicant to Yale Medical School. And those, those ones who are not among the chosen 5 have to go elsewhere. But the options were much greater than for a much larger number of Italian Catholics who might have wanted, who were in the United States, and obviously infinitely larger than for those people defined by law as Negro. Anti-Semitism, yes. Shaping of the kinds of communities that Jews built for themselves from the ground up, no. Okay, or not so that we could say it was the defining characteristic. Okay, now in much of this history that we've talked about, Jews were always free and able to build the kinds of communities they wanted. And that's one reason they have so many different synagogues in any one town. Okay, and that's why they have so many different organizations, because they didn't necessarily agree on what's the most appropriate or most comfortable or most acceptable way of being Jewish. And throughout the history of Jewish life in the United States, certainly after the end of the colonial period, the history of Jewish communities is institutions proliferating a little bit like, an amoeba, that each time there's a new little branch coming off. And we could read the histories, for example, of synagogues, and just about every synagogue was part of some other synagogue before that. And then there's a break off, and then a break off from the break off. And these break-offs were ideological, they were class, they were personality, but there was no barrier to starting a new synagogue, okay, or a new charitable society, or a new literary society, or a new cultural institution. Institutions rose or fell just because individual Jews or enough Jews supported them to be able to function, collect dues. In the end, this is all based on the money people are willing to donate. Okay, and therefore they have to appeal to what people want. So again, I can only give one example, and we can see how early this begins. So as again, I'm sure everybody knows, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States says, "We the people of the United States," and so on. Well, Shearith Israel, which is the first congregation in New York, had bylaws going back to the 1740s, okay? And those bylaws read, it placed the authority for the forming of the congregation in the hands of God and in the hands of Jewish tradition, okay? By in concurrence with the way in the manner of the people of Israel were founding this congregation. After the US Constitution was adopted, Shearith Israel's members decided it was time to rewrite the bylaws. And the new bylaws, remember, we the people, the new bylaws read, "We the members of Shearith Israel." So it's no longer Jewish tradition, it's no longer God, it's we the members of Shearith Israel, okay, have cobbled together this particular document. So it's putting power and authority in the hands of ordinary people, the members, and obviously those who contribute money to make the synagogue or again, whatever Jewish institution function. So in a way, I'm going to use this to wrap up. In this long history of the Jews of the United States, nobody was ever forced to be a Jew. Okay, they were Jews because they wanted to be, and they were Jews the way they wanted to be. And they were able to do this because they lived in a place where they experienced pretty much untrammeled freedom to do what they wanted, to make livings and to make comfortable livings over time, to participate in the larger society, politically, culturally, and to have access to the fullest bundle of rights that the society as a whole gave to anybody. So that's a really very quick journey through an extremely complicated and rich history.
So the first one was in reference to kind of the slave ownership period. Did Jews own slaves?
Okay. Yes. Okay. So Jews own slaves, and I'm going to offer a little bit to make beyond yes. So on the eve of the Civil War, okay, 1 out of 10 white Southerners owned slaves. So that's only 10% of the white population owned slaves, but 1 out of 4 Jews owned slaves. So Jews actually, even though their numbers were small, had a much higher concentration of slave ownership than the white population as a whole. Okay, it's also important that to just keep in mind that Jews not in the South, okay, Jews who lived in the areas, what we call the North, where slavery had been abolished, however, were deeply involved in the institution of slavery. So Jews were, as long as the slave trade existed, Jews were involved in international trade, and the slave trade was a significant part of that. And additionally, many Jews in places like Ohio and Illinois and New York and so on were made a living in the manufacture of garments. Okay, the manufacture of garments means relying upon the existence of cheap cotton. Okay, that is taking cotton, transforming it into cotton, making it into textiles, and the textiles get sewn into shirts and dresses and so on. And that existed because of slavery. And so, and the eve of the Civil War, Jews were not wholeheartedly for abolition. There were some Jews who were, but there were, in a way, as a population, it was not enthusiastically abolitionist.
This is a little more of a comment, but also part of the question. I'm not sure if you'll know this. The origins of colonial America was financially rescued by a Jewish man, and the person who said this can't remember his name, but he ended up dying in jail, they think. And also, do you know of the letter of the Jews of Rhode Island written by George Washington to the Jews of Newport?
Okay, great. So I'm going to answer the second part first. As George Washington was about to take office and in a way launch the government of the United States, he received letters. It's actually the exact same letter from the Jewish congregation in Newport and also from the Jewish congregation in Savannah, Georgia, saying, we wish you great fortune in your presidency and in this new nation. And we'd like you to know that we are here, that there are Jews living in your nation. And there were, both letters used the word, we bled for liberty. In other words, we participated in the revolution. And we'd like you to keep us in mind. Washington chose to answer this in a letter to the congregation in Newport, where, it's a fascinating document. We could spend several hours just picking apart that document. And Washington makes his famous statement. He said, to the stock of Abraham, okay, I pledge, that you are welcome here. He said, this is a nation to bigotry, no sanction. Okay, when the American Jewish Committee is founded in 1905, it takes that as its motto, to bigotry, no sanction. And Washington says, look, so long as you act like good citizens, you are welcome to be here and to thrive, and you shall sit under your fig trees and your vines and enjoy the bounty of American life. So it is kind of conditional in the sense that it says we really want you to be good citizens, but it is a document of not tolerance, but of you're part of this country, which is different than tolerance. It's just equality. Okay, equality and tolerance are not the same thing. As to your first question, there were, you may be confused, sort of conflating two things. Chaim Solomon was a Philadelphia Jew who was involved in financially rescuing Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. So he sold bonds and floated loans for the Americans. And now the languishing in jail. Maybe you're referring to Francis Salvador, who was Georgian, who was a man from Georgia, Jew from Georgia, who was captured by the British. He fought in the American army, and he was captured, and he died on a British prisoner of war ship in the harbor. So in terms of the American Revolution, some Jews were very supportive of the revolution, like Chaim Solomon and Francis Salvador. Some were very pro-British. Okay, the entire Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, for example, was very pro-Tory. And that's one reason they wrote that letter to Washington. And in a sense, they're saying, I know we didn't support the revolution, but hey, we're here anyhow. The Jewish community of New York was quite pro-American. And therefore, when the British occupied New York, they fled to Philadelphia. So they took their Torah scrolls with them and so on. So I think that those answer your question.
And we're running out of time, but can you briefly discuss some of the refusal of letting Jews come into America during World War II?
Okay, well, now there's again a subject for an entire lecture series. So let me say that again, in the lead up to World War II, during the war, obviously nobody's coming in, doesn't matter who, but in the lead up to the war, as many Jewish community leaders and the American Jewish press called for lifting the quotas on Poland, on Germany, on Austria, and so on. And that is allowing in more immigrants than the quotas would have allowed, and making these possible for Jews to come in as refugees. I mean, the quota system is never lifted. And so now, after 1938, the directive from the government, from the White House, was that German and Austrian and Czech quotas should be filled by Jews. The Jews should get preference. And in fact, the United States brought in or allowed in the largest number of German Jewish refugees, about 150,000. Now, a small fraction compared to the number of Jews, who were in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, which had already come under Nazi control. But I think the deeper question which was asked is, why not? Why didn't they lift the quotas and allow in German immigration, German, Czech, Austrian Jews, Polish Jews? And the answer is that Americans did not want immigrants. They had gone through this long debate about immigration restriction, and the United States is still in the throes of the Great Depression. And there was fear that new immigrants would take scant jobs away from Americans. And yeah, there was a kind of broad antipathy towards immigrants, whether Jewish or not. I think that we can take as a kind of example, the Italians, many liberal educated Italians were really chafing under the bit of Mussolini. Okay, and many of them would have wanted to come to the United States and get away from fascist regime. They don't lift the quotas on Italians either. Okay, and it was like, we don't want immigrants. And yeah, it's really sad what's happening to the Jews, but that's not our problem. Okay, now I think the question also has to be put in the context of after 1939. There was a great deal, Americans were still very committed to neutrality. They did not want the United States to go to war. And pretty much the only group of Americans who thought war was a good thing were the Jews. And so there was a real, we might say, gap between what Jews wanted and what the United States, that is the majority of the public, and therefore the government, what they wanted. And the two were miles apart.